The insurance investigator's voice echoed through the phone like a death sentence as Jessica Martinez stared at the photographs spread across her kitchen table, photographs that proved her mother hadn't died in a tragic car accident 15 years ago, but had been murdered in cold blood by someone who wanted it to look like an accident. "Ms. Martinez, I'm calling because we've reopened the case of your mother's death," Detective Sarah Chen said, her words cutting through the quiet of Jessica's Portland apartment like shards of glass. "New forensic technology has revealed evidence that contradicts the original accident report. Your mother, Carmen Martinez, was killed, and we believe we know who did it." Jessica's hands trembled as she picked up the crime scene photos that Detective Chen had delivered just an hour earlier, images that shattered everything she had believed about the worst day of her life and opened a wound she thought had healed years ago. Jessica was only 12 years old when her mother Carmen died in what police had ruled a single-car accident on Highway 101, just outside their small Oregon coastal town of Brookings. She remembered that October morning with painful clarity, the way her mother had kissed her forehead before leaving for her job at the insurance office, promising they would go shopping for Jessica's Halloween costume that evening. Carmen had been driving to work in her reliable Honda Civic when, according to the original police report, she lost control on a curve during a rainstorm and crashed into a tree. The car had caught fire, and by the time firefighters arrived, Carmen was already dead. The investigation lasted only 3 days before officials concluded that wet roads and excessive speed had caused the accident. Jessica's father, Miguel Martinez, had been devastated by the loss, and the family had moved away from Brookings within 6 months, starting over in Portland where the painful memories wouldn't haunt them every day. But now, 15 years later, Jessica was learning that everything about her mother's death had been a carefully constructed lie. Detective Chen explained that advances in accident reconstruction technology had allowed investigators to re-examine the physical evidence from Carmen's crash, and the new analysis revealed inconsistencies that had been missed in the original investigation. The damage patterns on the car suggested that Carmen's Honda had been struck by another vehicle before hitting the tree, but the original investigators had attributed the damage to the impact with the tree itself. More significantly, the new forensic analysis revealed traces of brake fluid on the road that indicated Carmen's brake lines had been severed before the accident, causing her to lose control when she tried to slow down for the curve. As Jessica absorbed this shocking revelation, Detective Chen delivered another bombshell that made her stomach drop with a sickening realization. "We've also discovered that your mother had recently uncovered evidence of a major insurance fraud scheme at her workplace," the detective said. She had been gathering documents and preparing to report her findings to federal authorities. "We believe she was murdered to prevent her from exposing this conspiracy." Jessica felt the world spinning around her as she remembered fragments of conversations from her childhood, her mother working late, making quiet phone calls, expressing concern about irregularities at work that she couldn't discuss with the family. Carmen had been the senior claims adjuster at Pacific Coast Insurance, a position that gave her access to confidential files and financial records that apparently revealed something worth killing for. Detective Chen arranged to meet Jessica at the Brookings Police Department the following week, where she would be shown all the evidence that had been uncovered in the reopened investigation. The drive back to her childhood town was surreal for Jessica, who hadn't returned since her family moved away all those years ago. As she drove down the familiar coastal highway, she passed the curve where her mother had died, and for the first time in 15 years, she stopped at the spot where the accident had occurred. Standing next to the tree that had supposedly killed her mother, Jessica felt a rage building inside her that was both terrifying and clarifying. Someone had taken Carmen's life and destroyed their family, then hidden behind a lie for 15 years while Jessica and her father grieved for what they believed was a tragic accident. At the police station, Detective Chen introduced Jessica to FBI Special Agent Marcus Thompson, who explained that the insurance fraud case had grown far beyond a single murder. "Your mother discovered that Pacific Coast Insurance was systematically denying legitimate claims while pocketing the money that should have been paid to policyholders," Agent Thompson said. "The scheme involved fake medical reviews, doctored accident reports, and bribed officials who would rule against claimants in court. Over 8 years, they stole an estimated $23 million from people who had paid premiums in good faith and deserved compensation when disasters struck their lives. Jessica learned that her mother had identified the key players in the conspiracy and had compiled evidence that would have sent several people to prison for decades, if she had lived long enough to present it to authorities. The investigation revealed that Carmen had been working with an FBI informant named David Walsh, a former Pacific Coast employee who had initially been part of the fraud scheme but had developed a conscience when he saw how the denied claims were destroying families' lives. David had approached Carmen because her reputation for integrity was well known throughout the company, and together they had been secretly photographing documents, recording conversations, and building a case that would expose the entire conspiracy. But someone within the company had discovered their investigation, and both Carmen and David had been marked for elimination. David had disappeared 3 days before Carmen's death and had never been found, leading investigators to assume he had also been murdered. As Jessica reviewed the evidence, she was amazed by her mother's courage and thoroughness in documenting the insurance fraud. Carmen had hidden copies of incriminating documents in a safety deposit box that Jessica hadn't even known existed, and she had kept a detailed diary of her investigation, recording dates, times, and conversations that proved the conspiracy involved not just Pacific Coast employees but also local police officers, medical examiners, and court officials who had been paid to support false accident and injury reports. The diary revealed that Carmen had known her life was in danger. In her final entries, she wrote about being followed, receiving threatening phone calls, and noticing that her car had been tampered with on multiple occasions. The most devastating revelation came when Agent Thompson showed Jessica the list of suspects in her mother's murder. At the top of the list was Thomas Brennan, who had been Pacific Coast's vice president of claims during Carmen's investigation and was now the company's CEO. Brennan had the most to lose from Carmen's investigation and had the resources to arrange her murder while covering up the evidence. But the second name on the list made Jessica's blood run cold: Detective Robert Hayes, who had been the lead investigator on Carmen's accident case and who had apparently been paid by the insurance company to ensure that the death was ruled accidental rather than suspicious. Hayes had retired from the police force 5 years earlier and was now living comfortably on what appeared to be a pension far larger than his police salary should have provided. But the name that shocked Jessica most was third on the list: Dr. Patricia Coleman, the medical examiner who had performed Carmen's autopsy and ruled that her death was consistent with injuries from a car accident. According to the FBI's investigation, Dr. Coleman had been receiving regular payments from Pacific Coast Insurance in exchange for ruling questionable deaths as accidental rather than suspicious, helping the company avoid paying life insurance claims to beneficiaries. Jessica realized that her mother's murder had been covered up at every level. The police investigation had been sabotaged, the medical examination had been fraudulent, and even the insurance claim on Carmen's own life insurance policy had probably been handled improperly. Agent Thompson explained that building a case against the suspects would require Jessica's cooperation, as she was now the key witness who could authenticate her mother's evidence and testify about the impact of the conspiracy on the victims' families. Jessica agreed immediately, driven by a need for justice that had been building inside her for 15 years without her even realizing it. But Agent Thompson warned her that reopening the case would put her own life in danger, as the same people who had killed her mother were still alive and still had resources to eliminate threats to their freedom. "These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they believe you're a threat," he said. "We can provide protection, but you need to understand that your life will never be the same once we move forward with this investigation." Over the next 6 months, Jessica worked closely with the FBI to build cases against all the suspects in her mother's murder. She testified before grand juries, provided handwriting samples to authenticate her mother's diary entries, and helped investigators locate additional evidence that Carmen had hidden in various locations around Brookings. The investigation expanded to include dozens of other suspicious deaths and denied insurance claims, revealing a conspiracy that had operated for over a decade and had affected hundreds of families throughout Oregon and Northern California. Jessica learned that her mother had been just one of several people who had been murdered to protect the insurance fraud scheme, and that Carmen's death had actually been the event that finally convinced other potential witnesses to stay silent. The most difficult part of the investigation was learning the details of how her mother had been killed. Forensic experts determined that Carmen's brake lines had been severed while she was at work, causing them to fail when she tried to slow down for the curve on Highway 101. But the killers hadn't left anything to chance. They had also loosened her steering mechanism, making it impossible for her to maintain control even if she had been able to stop. The FBI believed that Carmen had realized something was wrong with her car during the drive, as skid marks showed she had tried desperately to bring the Honda under control before it crashed into the tree. Most heartbreakingly, the new forensic analysis revealed that Carmen had survived the initial impact and had been alive when the car caught fire, meaning she had died knowing that someone had tried to kill her and understanding that she would never see her family again. The trial of Thomas Brennan began 18 months after Jessica first learned the truth about her mother's death. Brennan, now 62 years old, had continued working as CEO of Pacific Coast Insurance throughout the FBI investigation, apparently believing that his wealth and connections would protect him from prosecution. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records showed regular payments to corrupt officials, recorded conversations revealed him discussing problem employees who needed to be handled permanently, and testimony from other co-conspirators detailed his role in ordering Carmen's murder. Jessica attended every day of the 3-week trial, staring at the man who had ordered her mother's death and feeling a complex mixture of hatred and satisfaction as prosecutors methodically destroyed his defense. The most powerful moment of Brennan's trial came when Jessica took the witness stand and read excerpts from her mother's diary, sharing Carmen's own words about her fear for her safety and her determination to expose the insurance fraud despite the personal risk. "My daughter Jessica deserves to grow up in a world where people can trust that their insurance companies will be there when disaster strikes," Jessica read from one of her mother's final diary entries. "If something happens to me, I hope someone will continue this work and make sure these criminals face justice for what they've done to so many innocent families." As Jessica spoke those words, several jurors were visibly crying, and even the judge seemed moved by the courage Carmen had shown in her final weeks. Detective Robert Hayes was tried separately, and his case revealed the extent of police corruption that had allowed the insurance fraud to continue for so many years. Hayes had not only falsified the investigation into Carmen's death, but had also manipulated evidence in dozens of other cases involving suspicious deaths and accidents. His betrayal of his oath as a police officer was particularly painful for Jessica to witness, as she realized that her family had trusted the very person who was helping to cover up her mother's murder. Hayes showed no remorse during his trial, apparently still believing that his actions had been justified by the money he had received from the insurance company. Dr. Patricia Coleman's trial was the most disturbing for Jessica, as it revealed how a medical professional who was supposed to seek truth and provide closure for grieving families had instead perverted her position to help murderers escape justice. Coleman had falsified autopsy reports in at least 47 cases over 12 years, helping insurance companies avoid paying death benefits and allowing killers to escape prosecution. During her testimony, Jessica confronted Coleman directly, asking her how she could look at a murdered woman's body and lie about the cause of death, knowing that a 12-year-old daughter would grow up believing her mother had died in an accident. Coleman's only response was to say that she had been following orders and had never intended for anyone to get hurt. All 3 main suspects were convicted on multiple charges including murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. Thomas Brennan received life in prison without the possibility of parole, Detective Hayes was sentenced to 35 years, and Dr. Coleman received 28 years. The sentences provided some sense of justice for Jessica, but they couldn't undo 15 years of grief based on a lie, or restore the relationship she should have had with her mother during her teenage and adult years. More importantly, the convictions led to a comprehensive review of suspicious deaths throughout the Pacific Northwest, resulting in the reopening of over 200 cases and the identification of at least 12 other murder victims whose deaths had been disguised as accidents. The insurance fraud investigation ultimately recovered over $40 million in stolen funds, which were distributed to policyholders who had been illegally denied claims over the years. Jessica received a settlement for her mother's wrongful death, but she donated most of the money to establish the Carmen Martinez Foundation, a non-profit organization that helps families navigate suspicious death investigations and provides legal assistance to people whose insurance claims have been improperly denied. The foundation also works to reform medical examiner practices and police investigation procedures to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had allowed her mother's murder to be covered up for 15 years. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the investigation was the closure it provided for Jessica's father, Miguel, who had spent 15 years blaming himself for not being able to protect his wife and daughter from the accident that had destroyed their family. Learning that Carmen's death was murder rather than an accident helped Miguel understand that there was nothing he could have done to prevent it, and that Carmen had died as a hero who was trying to protect other families from the insurance company's fraud. Miguel became an active supporter of the Carmen Martinez Foundation and began speaking publicly about the importance of thorough death investigations and the need for stronger oversight of insurance company practices. Jessica's own healing process was complicated by the mix of emotions that came with learning the truth about her mother's death. On one hand, finally having answers about what had really happened brought a sense of closure that she hadn't even realized she needed. On the other hand, learning that her mother had been murdered rather than killed in an accident created a new kind of grief and anger that was difficult to process. Jessica entered therapy to help her cope with the trauma of the investigation and the complex emotions surrounding her mother's death, and she learned that discovering the truth about a loved one's murder can be both liberating and devastating at the same time. The investigation also changed Jessica's career path and life priorities in unexpected ways. Before learning the truth about her mother's death, Jessica had been working as a marketing coordinator for a software company, living a comfortable but relatively unremarkable life in Portland. But the experience of seeking justice for her mother inspired her to return to school for a law degree, specializing in victims' rights and insurance fraud cases. Jessica now works as an attorney for the Oregon Attorney General's office, prosecuting white-collar crimes and helping other families navigate the complex legal system when they suspect their loved ones may have been victims of murder disguised as accidents. 5 years after the trials ended, Jessica returned to the curve on Highway 101 where her mother had died, but this time she wasn't alone. She brought flowers, a framed photograph of Carmen, and a letter she had written describing everything that had happened since the investigation began. Standing next to the tree where her mother had taken her final breath, Jessica read the letter aloud, telling Carmen about the convictions of her killers, the families who had received justice because of her courage, and the foundation that would continue her work of protecting people from insurance fraud. "Mom, you didn't die in vain," Jessica said through her tears. "Your investigation saved hundreds of families, and your courage gave me the strength to seek justice not just for you, but for everyone who has been hurt by these criminals." The most surprising revelation came in Jessica's final conversation with Thomas Brennan, who agreed to meet with her in prison 3 years after his conviction. Jessica had requested the meeting because she needed to understand why Brennan had chosen to kill her mother rather than simply firing her or trying to discredit her investigation. Brennan, looking older and more frail than he had during the trial, told Jessica something that changed her understanding of her mother's final weeks. "Your mother wasn't just investigating insurance fraud," he said. "She had discovered that we were also involved in a human trafficking operation, using fake accident claims to launder money from forced labor and prostitution. If her evidence had become public, it would have exposed a network that included politicians, judges, and business leaders across 3 states. We couldn't let that happen." This revelation led to a new FBI investigation that ultimately exposed a major human trafficking ring and resulted in dozens of additional arrests and convictions. Jessica realized that her mother's murder had been even more significant than she had originally understood. Carmen hadn't just died trying to expose insurance fraud, she had died trying to expose a network of criminals who were enslaving and exploiting vulnerable people for profit. This knowledge made Jessica even more proud of her mother's courage and even more determined to continue the work Carmen had started. Today, Jessica visits her mother's grave every year on the anniversary of her death, but now she goes there to celebrate Carmen's life and courage rather than to mourn a tragic accident. She brings updates about the Foundation's work, stories about families who have been helped by Carmen's investigation, and news about ongoing efforts to reform insurance practices and death investigation procedures. Jessica has also started a scholarship program in her mother's name, helping young people from working-class families attend college and pursue careers in criminal justice, medicine, and social work, fields where they can continue Carmen's mission of protecting ordinary people from those who would exploit them. The experience of uncovering the truth about her mother's death taught Jessica that justice isn't always swift or certain, but it's always worth pursuing no matter how much time has passed or how powerful the perpetrators might be. Carmen Martinez died believing that someone would continue her work and ensure that the criminals she was investigating would eventually face consequences for their actions. 15 years later, her daughter proved that belief was justified, and Carmen's courage in the face of mortal danger continues to inspire new generations of people who refuse to let the powerful prey on the vulnerable without consequence. Jessica learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers or politicians, but by ordinary people like her mother who have the moral courage to stand up for what's right even when they know it might cost them everything.